In the autumn of 1945, the most powerful soldier in the Pacific gave an order, and a British general looked at it, decided it was wrong, and disobeyed it. The American Supreme Commander, General Douglas MacArthur, had ruled that defeated Japanese officers would not be made to surrender their swords. He called the ceremony archaic. He had his reasons, and they were good ones. But General William Slim, the man who had broken the Japanese army in Burma, believed MacArthur had just thrown away the single most powerful weapon left in the entire war, a weapon that fired nothing and killed no one, and yet could do something no bomb had managed. So Slim ignored the order of his own Supreme Commander, and across Southeast Asia, one by one, Japanese generals who had spent years as the most feared conquerors in Asia were marched forward to perform a single act that many of them found harder than anything they had faced in battle. They were made to take the sword from their own belt, the sword that in their world was not a weapon, but the very soul of a soldier, and hand it with their own hands to a British officer standing in front of them. For many of these men, hardened commanders who had ordered thousands to their deaths without flinching, this simple act was almost unbearable. Some could barely keep their composure. Some had to be ordered twice, because what the British were demanding of them was something their entire code told them was impossible. A public stripping away of everything that made a Japanese officer an officer at all. But here is what makes this story so strange. This ceremony, the surrender of the sword, was not some ancient tradition both sides understood. It was not part of the formal surrender at all, not in the way the Japanese expected, and the Supreme Allied Commander had specifically ordered it should not happen. The British did it anyway. Picture the scene that played out in Singapore in September 1945, in the very building where Britain had surrendered the city to Japan 3 years before. Japanese officers marched through streets lined with the people they had once ruled, on the exact ground of Britain's worst humiliation. That image did not happen by accident. It was engineered deliberately against the orders of the most powerful soldier in the Pacific. What you're about to hear is the story of that quiet act of defiance and a piece of psychological warfare so precisely aimed that it reached inside the mind of a beaten enemy and made him truly understand at last that he had lost. To see how that happened and why a sword could do what artillery could not, you first have to understand what that sword actually meant to the man wearing it. To understand why this one demand could unsettle men who had ordered thousands to their deaths without flinching, you have to understand what that sword actually was to the man wearing it. To a Japanese officer of the Second World War, the sword on his hip was not a relic and not an ornament. It was the physical embodiment of his honor, his authority, and his right to command. The tradition reached back centuries to the samurai, whose code had been deliberately revived and hammered into the modern Japanese army as the spiritual core of the soldier. The blade was often a family treasure, sometimes hundreds of years old, and to surrender it was nothing like a Western officer handing over his pistol. It was closer to handing over your name, your ancestors, and your very identity as a soldier in front of the men you had commanded, who would watch you do it. In their world, an officer who gave up his sword had given up his right to lead, and a man so shamed could not stand before his troops again. And the British commanders who designed the surrender ceremonies of 1945 understood this about their enemy just as completely. That is the whole point. They knew exactly what they were asking for and exactly what it would do. The man at the center of this was General William Slim, who by now needs little introduction. The commander who had been driven out of Burma in humiliating defeat and then come back over years of jungle fighting to break the very army that had beaten him. What matters here is this. Slim knew the Japanese soldier better than almost any Western commander alive, because he had been beaten by him and had learned to beat him in turn. And as the war came to its end, Slim was thinking hard about a problem that had nothing to do with weapons. The Japanese army had built its entire identity on the belief that it could not truly be defeated, that the Japanese fighting spirit made it superior to any Western force, no matter the circumstances. Slim understood that a signature on a surrender document signed by distant politicians in a faraway bay would mean almost nothing to a Japanese officer standing in a jungle in Malaya with thousands of armed men still under his command. That man needed to be shown, in a way he could not argue with, that the game was truly over, and Slim knew exactly the instrument that could do it. His idea was simple and merciless. Every Japanese officer, from the highest general down, would be required to surrender his sword in person to a British officer of equal or higher rank, in a formal ceremony in front of witnesses. There would be no hiding behind a piece of paper signed by someone else. Each commander would feel the weight of his own defeat in his own hands as he gave up the one object that meant the most to him. Slim said as much himself in words that leave no doubt about what he was doing. He was convinced, he wrote, that the most effective way to truly impress upon the Japanese that they had been beaten in the field was to insist on this ceremonial surrender of swords. No Japanese soldier, he believed, who had watched his own general march up and hand over his sword would ever again be able to tell himself that the invincible army was still invincible. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the careful application of exactly the right pressure on exactly the right point in the mind of a defeated enemy. And it was here that the strange conflict at the heart of this story appeared, because the most powerful Allied commander in the Pacific had decided to do the precise opposite. General Douglas MacArthur, the American supreme commander who would oversee the occupation of Japan itself, had taken a very different view. In his overall instructions for the surrender, MacArthur decided that the old ceremony of surrendering swords was, in his word, archaic and was not to be enforced. His reasoning was not sentimental. MacArthur was looking at the bigger picture of occupying and governing a defeated Japan, and there was a hard logic to leaving the swords alone. An officer's sword was the symbol of his authority over his own men, and in the immediate chaos after the surrender, the Allies in many places were going to need those Japanese officers to keep control of their own troops. There were well over 1 million armed Japanese soldiers scattered across Asia, far more than the thin Allied forces arriving to accept their surrender could possibly have controlled by themselves. If you strip an officer of his authority in front of his men, you may find you have no one able to march those men quietly into captivity. MacArthur, thinking like a ruler of the occupation to come, wanted the Japanese command structure left intact enough to be useful, so his order went out. The swords would not be demanded. And so we come back to that scene in Singapore, and now you can see it for what it really was. This was the city whose fall in 1942 had been the most catastrophic and humiliating defeat in British military history, and Lord Louis Mountbatten built the ceremony to answer that wound point for point. A fleet band played Rule Britannia. The guns fired a 17-gun salute. The same Union flag that had been hauled down in surrender in 1942 was hoisted again to the national anthem, on the same ground, before the same population. Every detail was chosen to say one thing to the watching Japanese and the watching world. The humiliation has been reversed, and reversed completely.
On that day in Singapore, it was General Itagaki who signed the surrender, standing in for his superior, the supreme Japanese commander in the southern region, Field Marshal Count Terauchi, who lay too ill to attend after a stroke. And it is Terauchi who gives us the single most telling moment of the entire affair.
Because Mountbatten was not satisfied with a signature of a deputy, he insisted that Terauchi himself, the most senior Japanese commander in the whole theatre, must surrender his sword to him in person. And so, months later, at the end of November 1945 in Saigon, the old field marshal was brought before Mountbatten to do exactly that. Terauchi surrendered not one sword, but two, and the detail of those blades tells you everything about what was being given up. One was a short sword, forged in the 16th century. The other was a long sword forged in the 13th century, a weapon already more than a century old when Henry V fought at Agincourt, passed down through the generations into the hands of a man who now had to place it, in defeat, into the hands of his enemy. Think about what it means to be the guardian of a blade that has survived 700 years of history, and to be the one who finally loses it. That was the weight the British understood, and the weight they made every Japanese commander carry. Up and down the region, in dozens of separate ceremonies, the same act was repeated, photographers capturing each moment because everyone involved understood exactly what it cost the man handing the sword across. One of those captured blades, taken from a Japanese general who had fought Slim in Burma, ended up on the mantelpiece of Slim's own home, exactly where, he wrote, he had always intended that one day it should be. For a man who had been driven out of Burma in defeat and had clawed his way back to victory, it was the most personal trophy of all.
Now, it is worth being honest about a piece of this, because the story is sometimes told as though every Japanese commander was reduced to a trembling wreck, and that is the kind of exaggeration that creeps into history when a good image takes hold. The truth needs no exaggeration. Not every officer broke down. Many performed the act with stiff, controlled dignity, which in its own way was its own kind of suffering, holding yourself rigid through a moment designed to unmake you. But the deeper truth that the British were counting on held firm. Whatever face a man kept while he did it, the act itself could not be undone, and it could not be argued with. A sword handed over is a sword handed over. The symbolism worked precisely because it bypassed words entirely. A defeated general could tell himself any number of stories about why the war had really been lost, about betrayal, about the bomb, about forces beyond his control, but he could not tell himself a story in which he had not, with his own hands, in front of witnesses, given his sword to the enemy. The British had found the one statement that could not be denied or explained away, and they made every Japanese officer in the theatre make it.
So what did the British order really achieve, and why does it still matter? On the surface, it confused and unsettled Japanese commanders because it demanded something their own Supreme Command and the Americans had signaled would not be required, and because it struck at a part of them that no surrender document could reach. But underneath that, it was something more interesting than mere humiliation. It was a recognition by men like Slim that wars do not truly end when the shooting stops. They end inside the minds of the defeated, when the belief that sustained the fighting finally collapses. The Japanese army had been beaten in the field long before the autumn of 1945, but its spirit, the conviction of its own invincibility, was a harder thing to kill than any army. Slim understood that you could not bomb that belief out of existence, and you could not capture it with territory. You could only dismantle it by forcing the men who held it to perform with their own hands the one act that made the defeat real and personal and impossible to deny. The sword on the table did what the surrender document signed in Tokyo Bay could not. It made a proud and beaten enemy understand, at last and beyond all argument, that the invincible army was invincible no longer. And it is why, of all the images of the end of the war in the East, the ones that lingered were not of documents being signed, but of proud men in uniform handing over the soul of the soldier they had been to the enemy they had sworn they could never lose to.